Now, a study by the Human Sciences Research Council has found that South Africans are increasingly dissatisfied with democracy. Many South Africans, particularly young people, are losing faith in the democratic system. Back in 2004, when the country was celebrating a decade of democracy, 59% of the survey's respondents were happy with democracy. Now, only 32% are satisfied. Joining us is a senior research specialist in the developmental capable and ethical state, Dr. Stephen Gordon, and Thuma Foundation founder and Law Trust Chair in Social Justice at the Stellenbosch University, Professor Thuli Madonsela. Good evening to you, and thank you very much for your time and your patience holding on there. We had to take that connection to the Ukraine with John Steenhuisen very briefly. But let's get back to our conversation tonight. Why is it that the satisfaction in how democracy is working is waning, or at least on the decline? Let's start with you, Dr. Gordon.
Oh, thank you very much. So as you correctly point out, in 2004, satisfaction with how democracy was working in South Africa was quite robust, with the majority of the adult population exhibiting levels of satisfaction with the way democracy was functioning. When Jacob Zuma came into power, we witnessed a steady and decline in satisfaction with democracy. Indeed, satisfaction with democracy reached its lowest level in 2017, 23% of the adult population saying that they are satisfied with democracy. When Cyril Ramaphosa became president, we saw a somewhat bump in this level of satisfaction rising to 35% in 2018. However, we, of course, have seen a drop-off in satisfaction with democracy. The latest figures for 2021 have satisfaction with democracy at only 27% of the adult population. Now, of course, it's important to understand that this is not spread evenly throughout the country. So some provinces, for example, have much higher levels of satisfaction than others. Mpumalanga, for example, has the highest level of satisfaction with democracy in the country. But some of the provinces with the lowest levels of satisfaction are KwaZulu-Natal, which has borne the brunt of a series of negative events, particularly for our viewers today. We should keep in mind the July 2021 social unrest, which caused widespread property damage and loss of life.
Yeah.
We also have to remember that the Western Cape has suffered a series of problems in the last year, particularly with gangsterism and a rise in criminal violence. Satisfaction with the way democracy was working in the Western Cape fell by 19 percentage points between 2020 and 2021, a significant indication of a growing dissatisfaction with the direction South Africa is heading in that province.
Yeah. Before we bring in Professor Madonsela in a moment, in a study like this, Dr. Gordon, how do you value democracy? I mean, what is it that makes democracy valuable to people? What do they look at? What is the matrix? What do they count that would say to them, this makes democracy valuable to me?
Absolutely. So the South African Social Attitude Survey has been looking precisely at this question, asking people what demographic values mean the most to them. So those democratic values that are most important to the average South African are free and fair elections, are politicians that listen to voters, as well as a sense that people are free to express themselves both in speech and in mass gatherings. So these are the three areas that people really care about when you ask them what democratic values are most important to them. Another thing we must bear in mind is that many people have viewed the last 5 years in quite negative terms, feeling that unemployment, crime, and social instability has increased over the last 5 years. This growth of societal pessimism has not been good for general satisfaction with democracy.
Yeah. Professor Madonsela, I mean, are you surprised that democracy or at least satisfaction in democracy and how it's working is waning in the citizenry of South Africa?
Greetings, Thabo, and to the colleague, and also greetings to viewers. No, Thabo, I am not surprised. The Thuli Madonsela Foundation for Democracy, Literacy and Leadership was established at a time when there was gross dissatisfaction with democracy and also misunderstanding of what democracy is. And I was persuaded by my two children, Mbuso Wabantu and Wenzile, to establish a democracy foundation. And also the work we've been doing here at Stellenbosch University has brought up data that has been showing for a very long time that there's a decline in satisfaction with democracy. And we've written about this, and we've said this in all of our summits, that if we don't make progress on social justice, those who trust democracy as an instrument for expanding the frontiers of freedom will continuously reject democracy, or at least democracy as we know it.
Professor Madonsela, what then should we make of politicians who are beginning to be talking down those democratic values, constitutional democratic values that we used to hold so high? Should we read that to say this decline in democratic satisfaction was a deliberate thing, and was it by design?
Well, I would start with the last one, Thabo. I don't think the decline in democratic values has been by design. I just think there's been a lapse in constitutional governance. Our constitution mentions democracy or democratic governance or democratic values 28 times. That is the amount of importance we wanted to attach to democracy. And it's also one of the touchstones that have to be considered when you considering limitation of rights. It is also one of the founding values, and it's also one of the three goals of our democracy, which is democratic values, social justice, and fundamental human rights. What has gone wrong is that there isn't always a thinking when people make policies or decisions on what will be the implications on the democratic promises of the South African Constitution. So that's the first one. The second thing is the politicians who are now jumping on the bandwagon of talking down our democracy. I just think that's just being irresponsible, because none of those politicians have been outside the system. They've all been part of the system. They all had a responsibility to govern according to the guardrails in the Constitution. They say this Constitution has not delivered on the aspirations of people when it comes to equalizing opportunities, as Jolene Stein Kutsi mentions. The reality is that the Constitution has all of the guardrails and instruments for delivering on the people's aspirations, but it has not always been adhered to.
Dr. Gordon, what meaning do South Africans place on leadership, leaders in particular, in delivering their democracy, and what value as well or weight do they put on institutions like the media, like the judiciary, and even maybe one would say the Constitution in delivering democracy?
That is a very important question. What we have seen over the last 10 years is a substantial decline in institutional trust in South Africa. South Africans have lost faith in national government, local government, and parliament. Trust in these institutions falling dramatically. Now, we can ask, why has this taken place? There are several very important reasons. We must understand that what people want from a democracy is a democracy that delivers justice, economic growth, jobs, and security. And when there's a failure to achieve this, then people start to lose faith in political institutions, in democratic practices and in political leaders. What the South African people want to see, if you ask them what is the most important thing to you, they talk about reducing unemployment, they talk about reducing corruption, reducing poverty, reducing crime. These are the kind of outcomes they would like to see from government. The failure to deliver on the basic promises of democracy is resulting in this backlash that we have observed over the recent period. Indeed, it is part of the reason that, as you alluded to in opening this segment, we have seen such a decline in youth participation in traditional democratic practices such as voting.
Now, if democracy, they view it as not a desirable or even the best political system to achieve a just society, what do they think is an option?
See, this is the very pertinent, relevant, and somewhat worrying question. We at the Human Science Research Council have asked people if democracy is the best possible system, or would people prefer another system? And a minority, but a significant minority, indicated preference for a non-democratic system. This indicates that there is a worrying trend among some in our electorate to promote anti-democratic practices. But I think fundamentally what most citizens want is a democracy that delivers for them, a democracy in which they feel their voices are heard. One of the major issues that ordinary voters have with South Africa is that politicians do not listen to voters, they do not listen to the voice of the people, and they are not punished when they fail to not only listen to what ordinary people want, but when they engage in practices that are both corrupt and maladministrative, causing problems with governance, problems with aid, and problems with economic development.
Now, Professor Madonsela, at the Institute, when you teach democracy to the people who come to your campaigns and your seminars, right? Are we having honest conversations around what democracy can deliver and what democracy cannot?
We found that the majority of people, when we start with them, do not clearly know what democracy means, and also that it can be articulated in different ways. And therefore, what we found, for example, is that there isn't apathy about voting. It's just that young people, as the HSRC has found, feel that the way things are done currently do not maximize their agency. And when it comes to democracy, I want to just mention two things that are emerging from the data that we've been collecting since 2017, is that the average indigenous African in South Africa is not looking for economic growth, is looking for economic inclusion, because growth without inclusion means nothing to Palesa Musa. And you know that we have the M Plan for Social Justice, which is the Musa Plan for Social Justice. It really was influenced by a dialogue that we had in 2017 where master's students alike and uneducated people alike were saying, we don't want democracy. Our parents fought for freedom and got this thing that is called democracy. And this thing that is called democracy has exactly the same shackles that our parents had under apartheid. Whereas our parents were shackled by past laws, we are shackled by poverty. So to a certain extent, I can agree with the HSRC, but people are saying democracy should free them from poverty. But also they want democracy in South Africa to free them from the inequalities that were created by colonialism and apartheid. Of course, they also want democracy that delivers services. And there's also confusion there about what the state should do. There's a tendency to think that it is entirely government's job to create jobs, and it's entirely government's job to deliver energy, such as what ESCOM does. And we know that that doesn't necessarily has to be done by government. There are countries like the UK and many European countries where government creates the conditions where ordinary people can deliver energy to each other. And of course, government regulates things such as water because those are finite resources.
Yeah. So what do we need to do to reverse this sense of illusion that young people especially are feeling around the concept of democracy?
I want to say one quick thing there is that you ask my colleague Gordon, what are people putting on the table? What frightens me from what I've heard from students at Stellenbosch University, not necessarily our students, but there's a growing movement that calls itself the abolitionists, constitutional abolitionists, because they're blaming the Constitution for the fact that they remain shackled in inequality, no matter how hard they run, no matter how fast they run and how hard they work. The rigged monopoly game that existed during apartheid and colonialism still makes it impossible for the indigenous Africans, the coloureds and the Indians to find themselves reaping the same rewards that are reaped by those that were historically advantaged under apartheid. So they are wanting the Constitution to be abolished. So what is the way forward? I think education about democracy, but secondly, government should govern constitutionally. There isn't constitutional governance and accountability, because if there was, every law, every action by government would only be signed off if it achieves the three goals of the Constitution: democratic values, social justice, and fundamental human rights. And if it also frees the potential of every person and improves the quality of life of every person. Those questions are not asked before laws and processes are approved by government.
Prof. Gordon, Dr. Gordon, rather, as we wrap up, what is your modeling telling you in terms of this research as far as the trajectory of this anti-democratic sentiment? And Professor Madonsela is already mentioning some of the populists calling themselves the abolitionists,
Yes.
beginning to emerge.
Yes. Well, what we've seen in South Africa over the last 10 years, particularly in the last 5 years, is a growing dissatisfaction with the status quo, a growing cynicism about the way things are currently done, both politically and economically. Now, this is a very unstable system. This is a very fragile system. We cannot exist in a situation in which a large majority of the citizenry, of voters, believe that the system is corrupt, that the country is going in the wrong direction, and that you cannot trust elected leaders. In such a situation, there will reach a tipping point, and then we will see substantial change. Now, what that substantial change will look like is always very unclear in fragile situations like this. But we can always take a more positive view than I think perhaps has been outlined by some of my colleagues. Think about Ukraine, which has often been in the news media in recent days. The Ukrainian people were once under the thumb of oligarchs, a very corrupt political system which gave ordinary voters very little choice. This led to a series of public protests and a call for more democratic inclusion and participation. We saw the rise of a new political movement which is now currently representing Ukraine in its war against Russia. Now, this movement started off small, but was able to seize power because it promised democratic change, economic inclusion, and accountability for corruption. If a similar movement, both started within existing political parties or coming from outside, was available, I think you would see an extreme excitement about democracy, about constitutionalism. On the other hand, we could see real and meaningful economic reform, a delivery by government in those areas which people care about: job creation, crime reduction. We should increase satisfaction in democracy, trust in government, trust in parliament. These are different options which we could see in the future, which might be more positive than some of the more doomsday-style scenarios that are often floated in the media.